I definitely think this is a strategic failure on Russia's part. A lot of what Russia was demanding before the full-scale invasion was this strategic demand on NATO to weaken itself, to split the alliance, to roll it back to the borders before it started expanding in Eastern Europe. Um, and so the fact that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, that is a strategic failure. If the war in Ukraine aimed to weaken NATO, to ensure that Russia could possibly win in a conventional war against NATO, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that is a strategic failure.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Riley Bailey, Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. Riley, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
To begin with, what is your assessment of Russia's offensive in the northeast of Ukraine? Are we starting to see signs that it has stalled?
Yeah, we've definitely seen the tempo of Russian offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast slow. They start to slow pretty immediately. By May 14th, we had started to see the tempo slow, the advances slow, but that's not to necessarily state that it is over. Russian forces could be pausing to prepare for launching intensified waves of assaults, and they are likely preparing for a second phase of their offensive operation in northern Kharkiv Oblast.
And so why do we think it is starting to slow down? Is that because of tactics we're seeing, maybe new tactics from the Ukrainians?
No, not necessarily. Russian forces conducted limited offensive operations. That didn't seem like the case because there was relatively rapid gains when they launched offensive operations into northern Kharkiv Oblast on May 10th, but they advanced through relatively less defended areas, small border settlements that Russian forces had largely destroyed by the time they went to go advance into those settlements, and Ukrainian officials have confirmed that those areas were less defended. So those are some of the reasons why we saw rapid gains, but Russian forces have committed very limited manpower to these operations. There was a lot of reporting that Russian forces intended to create a grouping of forces in the international border area between 50,000 to 70,000 personnel in size. A lot of the reporting that we have seen from Ukrainian sources is that they only got that grouping up to around 35,000 personnel when they launched the offensive operation to northern Kharkiv Oblast. And we haven't really seen Russian forces introduce additional reserves to sustain the tempo of offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast, indicating that they're likely still building out this force grouping, and they might have launched this offensive operation earlier than they intended.
And to what extent do you think some of the early gains that Russia made in the northeast when it launched this offensive are down to the fact that the Ukrainians made a deliberate strategy to withdraw some of their forces and trade space for time?
I don't know if that is the case, but I definitely think there is not a utility in defending right at the border that opens you up to more Russian artillery. Russian artillery can operate more securely within Belgorod Oblast. Defending a little further back from the border allows Ukrainian forces a little bit more security. It also puts Russian forces in a bit more of a bind, attacking into the main line of defense further in to northern Kharkiv Oblast than right at the border.
What do you think the wider strategic objective is for Russia in the northeast? There's been talk of them trying to create a buffer zone. Do you think that is what they're trying to achieve?
I think the strategic element of this, the strategic objective, is to draw and fix Ukrainian forces across a wider front in northeastern Ukraine. Russian forces have been conducting ongoing offensive operations in eastern Ukraine since October 2023. Opening this front in northern Kharkiv Oblast has forced Ukrainian forces to transfer materiel, manpower from other sectors of the front, and it fixes them to this international border area so they can't deploy elsewhere to ongoing Russian offensive operations elsewhere in eastern Ukraine. So we have seen that this has achieved its impacts. There is reporting that Ukrainian forces have redeployed elements from many sectors of the front to Kharkiv Oblast, northern Kharkiv Oblast, and we have seen Russian forces try to exploit that and intensify offensive operations in areas where Ukrainian forces have redeployed units. That's the strategic objective of this. And it's not just the ongoing offensive operations that we see in northern Kharkiv Oblast, it's even the concentrations elsewhere in Belgorod Oblast, in Kursk, Bryansk, along the border with Sumy Oblast and other areas of northern Kharkiv Oblast. Even though there's not ongoing offensive operations there, those concentrations do have an intended effect of fixing elements further along the international border area, and kind of putting Ukraine on its toes about preparing defensive positions, preparing for defensive operations, just in case there is further offensive activity further along the border area. There's also operational intent to the offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast. One is this buffer zone that you mentioned. This has been a routine line in the Kremlin and the Russian information space about the need to create a buffer zone, a sanitary zone into Kharkiv Oblast to protect border areas in Russia from Ukrainian shelling, specifically Belgorod city. And this has been a long time justification that Russian sources, Russian officials have used to argue for further gains in other areas of the front. If you start to think about it, the border zone, the buffer zone kind of doesn't have an end, because once they establish and occupy that area, then that area is under shelling and it becomes this ever creeping front and justification for further and further gains into Ukraine. And we have seen Russian officials kind of acknowledge that that is the case. We've had Dmitry Medvedev state that the buffer zone really needs to extend all the way to the borders of Ukraine and possibly into Poland. So this is very much a justification for establishing a foothold in northern Kharkiv Oblast. There's also another possible operational intent of advancing not to the boundaries of Kharkiv city, but to within tube artillery range of Kharkiv city, or effective tube artillery range, so that Russian forces could deploy artillery elements and conduct routine indirect fire on Kharkiv city and prepare for a larger offensive operation on the city at a later date.
I kind of share your skepticism about the buffer zone argument, because if you look at the amount of territory that Russia have gained in recent weeks in the northeast, yes, okay, it's symbolically important and it's disappointing for the Ukrainians, but it's not actually that much territory when you look at it on a map, and it hasn't appeared to prevent the Ukrainians still having success at targeting Belgorod.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the area, maybe it's creating a buffer zone immediately south of Belgorod city, but there's still areas in northwestern Kharkiv Oblast and Sumy Oblast that Ukrainian forces could use to strike into Belgorod Oblast. So they're creating this very narrow buffer zone. And so that's something we might see in a possible second phase of the offensive operation here, as an attempt to widen that buffer zone along a wider section of the border area.
Well, that's interesting. That brings us on to what Russia may do next. You mentioned Sumy Oblast. Do you think that is where we're going to have to look next, and that is where Russia are going to prioritize next?
So we recently saw, I think this was yesterday, President Zelensky state that there is a unspecified grouping of forces of an unspecified size being concentrated in western Belgorod Oblast. He didn't quite state where. He said 90 kilometers northwest of Kharkiv city, but that's notably in an area that allows Russian forces to either launch offensive operations to the west into Sumy Oblast, or to the south into northwestern Kharkiv Oblast. And that kind of allows them to have this greater effect of drawing and fixing Ukrainian forces, because Ukrainian forces don't really know the operational intent of that grouping of forces. And so they will have to prepare for possible defensive operations both in Sumy Oblast near the border, but also in northwestern Kharkiv Oblast near the border. So it has this wider strategic objective, whether or not Russian forces attack into Sumy or whether they attack into northwestern Kharkiv Oblast.
How well placed, Riley, would you say Ukraine is at the moment to defend, for example, a new offensive in Sumy?
That remains to be a little unseen. Surely those settlements immediately along the border might not be as well defended as positions further back. A lot of what the northern grouping of forces has deployed along the international border area appears to be deployed in Belgorod Oblast. So a Russian offensive operation either from Kursk or Bryansk into areas of Sumy Oblast likely would be so limited as to not have very significant advances associated with it. We could see marginal advances either further south in Sumy Oblast or in that northwestern part of Kharkiv Oblast. But by all intents and purposes, it does very much appear that they still haven't brought the northern grouping of forces up to its reported planned and strength, and that we likely won't see a very large intensified effort until that happens.
And yet, even whilst Russia have been making gains in the northeast, their casualty rate continues to rock up. I just wonder what your analysis is of that, because Ukrainian intelligence now reporting, and of course, Russia don't disclose their losses, but according to Ukraine, it's now over 500,000 Russian soldiers killed or injured. What is your analysis of the Russian casualty rate?
I think we need to compare those casualty rates with the forces that they're generating. And for several months now, Russian forces have created a sustainable force generation apparatus, which roughly allows them to produce in a month the amount of forces that they lose in a month. And we see this routine arrival of new reinforcements to forces along the front line that allows them to sustain the tempo of their offensive operations. Maybe not immediately. They'll temporarily pause or decrease activity on one front while increasing it on another, bring those reinforcements in, and then re-intensify. And so we kind of see this ever constant pulsating along the front. So one sector will decrease while another sector increases, but over time in the aggregate, they're able to sustain the tempo of their offensive operations throughout eastern Ukraine. And so those casualties don't really have an immediate impact on the Russian ability to sustain their offensive operations. Those casualties do decrease and degrade the combat effectiveness of Russian forces, but largely Russian forces are conducting offensive operations in many areas in the same way, these frontal assaults, these meat assaults that don't require a whole lot of combat capabilities, but that are trying to leverage Russia's advantages in manpower and materiel to try to create a penetration somewhere.
And of course, one of the big debates among Ukraine's allies in the West in recent weeks and months, and it continues, is on whether Ukraine should be able to use NATO-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russia. We've seen now Poland's foreign minister come out and say that he believes Western-supplied weapons should be used in that way. He joins the foreign ministers of Germany and also the UK in saying such. It appears the people who are most reluctant still are the Americans. Why do you think that is, and do you think we will see a shift from the White House?
I'm not going to comment on any specific Western official's position, but I think a lot of this is a result of an intentional effort by the Kremlin to constrain the conversations and debates in the West about what support to Ukraine looks like. We have seen these routine information operations from before the start of the full-scale invasion, in which Kremlin officials, all the way up to Putin, threaten escalation for any minor advancement in Western support to Ukraine. They try to scare Western officials, scare the wider West into opposing limits, self-imposing limits on our debate about what support to Ukraine looks like. And in many regards, this has been successful. We routinely see Kremlin officials engage in nuclear saber rattling, engage in discussions about ceasefires and negotiations at critical times of support to Ukraine. We saw this back all the way in the winter of 2022 into 2023. We saw Russian officials engage in these types of information operations at a time when the West was talking about supplying armored vehicles to Ukraine. And now it's coming at a time when we're having this debate about whether or not we want to lift the prohibitions we've placed on Ukrainian forces for striking within Russian territory. And we're seeing that intensified information effort from the Kremlin again.
And if, let's say, America shifted its position and NATO-supplied weapons were able to be used on a broader scale to hit Russian targets, what impact would that have on the war?
I think we can look at northern Kharkiv Oblast as a really clear example of how this has been kind of constraining Ukrainian capabilities and giving Russian forces more operational flexibility. Russian forces used Belgorod Oblast basically as a sanctuary to stage, concentrate, and then launch combat operations into northern Kharkiv Oblast, and Ukrainian forces had limited capabilities to strike those concentrations. Even more importantly, we've seen Russian forces use tactical aviation to conduct wide-scale glide bomb strikes throughout the front line. A lot of that they have to do over occupied territory, so Ukrainian air defenses can shoot those aircraft down. But in the international border area, those aircraft can safely use the airspace in Russia to conduct routine glide bomb strikes, and Ukrainian forces don't really have the capabilities to respond to that.
It is interesting, though, how even despite those constraints, Ukraine continues to have some success, particularly with its use of drone attacks. I mean, according to Ukrainian intelligence, a Ukrainian drone attacked a Russian early warning radar near the city of Orsk at record distance. I mean, throughout this entire conflict, since the full-scale invasion began, we've seen a remarkable operation by the Ukrainians using low-cost commercial drones. Just talk a bit about that, Riley. I mean, are we still seeing innovation from the Ukrainians in that field?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing innovations in drone warfare, both on the Ukrainian and Russian side. This is something that Ukraine has very much invested in, specifically in the past few months because of delays in Western security assistance. This was an area that was relatively cheap for them to scale up. The technology was readily available. And so we have now seen Ukrainian forces in the past few months conduct a routine strike campaign far into Russia with these drones. Those have had some success, although drones can only carry such a large payload and only can conduct such precision strikes. And if they were able to use more long-range strike capabilities from the West, they could cause wider damage at these airfields that they strike with drones, at these oil refineries, at other military targets within Russia.
And then on the flip side, what are we seeing from Russia in the field of drone warfare?
We've definitely seen Russian forces heavily rely and scale up their use of the Shahhed drones and their routine missile and drone strikes. They have very heavily integrated that into those strikes in a way that allows them to test and pressure limited and degraded Ukrainian air defense systems in a better way so that more destructive systems like the missiles can get through. We'll often see them launch those Shaheds first to overwhelm and add pressure to air defenses, so then missile systems can get through and strike targets. On the tactical level, we've seen Russian forces, as well as Ukrainians, heavily integrate small commercial drones into their reconnaissance fire complexes. So drones will heavily provide recon and visibility to Russian forces so they can use their superior artillery advantages to greater effect.
Now, according to the ISW, Russia's defense industrial base will reportedly manufacture and refurbish 3 times as many artillery shells as the West will produce in 2024, although Russian shells reportedly suffer from quality control issues and Ukrainian artillery is reportedly more precise than Russian artillery. What more would you say needs to be done or could be done, Riley, to ramp up Western military production?
I definitely think this is a strategic issue. I think for the longest time, the West thought that the war would be over in a matter of a few years, whereas in Ukraine and Russia, I think there was this dawning realization much earlier that this was going to be a long war effort. And we've seen both on the Ukrainian and Russian side this effort, even though gradually, to mobilize their defense industrial base to a larger scale to support this sustained fight, large scale fighting in Ukraine. And I think the West has only really realized that they're going to have to do the same. And so there's this idea that Russia's much further ahead of the West in producing the materiel that they'll need to fight the war in Ukraine. That's not to say that the West couldn't mobilize its superior economy, its greater access to the international economy for critical components to quickly close that gap. But that does take a strategic vision to understand that there is going to be a long-term effort to mobilize the Western DIB for that effort.
And where would you say that production shortfall is most keenly felt at the moment? Is it artillery shells or is it other weaponry?
I definitely think we see that most pronounced with artillery shells. The United States just recently resumed aid. They have a large stockpile of artillery shells and some capabilities to produce them that are better than Europe. But I definitely think we've seen a lot of constraints on the European side for providing the shells. There was a pledge that by March 2024, European partners were going to provide 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine. They fell very much short of that. They have now, there's the Czech initiative to go and find shells elsewhere. So there does appear to be an issue on the European side about scaling up the production of shells. But I do think that is just a very pronounced representation of a lot of the issues that we see on the European side about using their defense enterprises, integrating and cooperating with one another to scale up production. But that's not to say that the Europeans aren't making headway on this. If you look at the Europe that existed 2 years ago in terms of defense spending, in terms of defense enterprises, and the Europe that exists now, there has been a radical shift. I just think Europe was in a place before the full-scale invasion that made it much more difficult to get a whole lot of these maneuvers, these mechanisms moving.
Just on that, Riley, how is that seen in Russia? When you hear Western countries, for example, the UK, pledging to commit to 2.5% of GDP defence spending, when you have, 2 newer members of NATO than we had 2 years ago, did Russia miscalculate, and how is it viewed now in terms of the response that we've seen from the West? Albeit, as we've been articulating, there'll be people who think the West needs to go further.
Yeah, I think this is a little nuanced. So, to your first point, I definitely think this is a strategic failure on Russia's part. A lot of what Russia was demanding before the full-scale invasion was this strategic demand on NATO to weaken itself, to split the alliance, to roll it back to the borders before it started expanding in Eastern Europe. And so the fact that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, that is a strategic failure. If the war in Ukraine aimed to weaken NATO, to ensure that Russia could possibly win in a conventional war against NATO, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that is a strategic failure. I think the West's response has had a mixed result, though. I think specifically the past few months, with these increased debates about support for Ukraine, the delays in Western security assistance, specifically in the United States, did convince a whole lot of Russian officials in the Kremlin that there is a finite limit to Western support, and that Russian forces can outweigh and outlast whatever materiel the West provides to Ukraine in the near to medium term, and then achieve victory once the West decides that these debates are going to resume and that delays are going to continue. Although I do think Russian officials do use the West's response to their advantage to tell their public to justify the war in Ukraine as a wider scale war with the collective West, as a war with NATO.
And just finally, Riley, as an analyst, where will you be looking at most closely, or what will you be looking out for in the next few months to give us a sense of the direction in which this war is heading?
So, Russian forces are still expected to launch a large scale summer offensive effort. That is not what Russian forces launched in northern Kharkiv Oblast. That could be the initial preparatory phase for that large scale summer offensive effort, but Russian forces still haven't started that. They've been preparing operational reserves for that effort, and Ukrainian officials have been routinely warning that there is going to be this large scale offensive effort. And likely that will be somewhere in eastern Ukraine where Russian forces have been conducting ongoing offensive operations. So that's either going to be along the Kupiansk-Svyatova-Kreminna line, the Kharkiv-Luhansk axis, near Chasiv Yar, or west of Avdiivka. It's a little unclear where Russian forces intend to launch that large-scale offensive effort, but they'll likely do it in an area where they see opportunities to make rapid tactical gains and possibly operationally significant gains. We will see resumed U.S. security assistance arrive to the front line at scale sometime in June and July, according to Western and Ukrainian officials, and that will give Ukrainian forces the capability to blunt a whole lot of Russian advances.
Riley Bailey, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.